Before we kick on, let's thank our sponsor, Kyndryl, who runs and reimagines the technology systems that drive advantage for the world's leading businesses. Kyndryl underpins the IT infrastructure behind so many of the world's banks, healthcare, and so much more. With a unique blend of AI powered consulting built on unmatched managed service capability, Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. You can find more about Kyndryl and the Kyndryl Institute at KYNDRYL. And don't forget, you can win a copy of today's book with thanks to Kyndryl. Just sign up to the Innovation Show Substack, the Thursday Thought on Substack, and you'll be in with a chance to win a copy of this book. Today's book is a practical, no-nonsense guide to everyday creativity, not the mythology, genius type, but the incremental, observable, learnable kind available to each one of us. The central argument is that creativity is not a gift, but a skill, and the most transformative innovation happens in small, compounding moves rather than in lightning bolt moments. The book is built around the acronym CREATE, 6 sequential skills: clarify, replicate, elaborate, associate, translate, and evaluate, with each having its own chapter, worked examples, personal stories, and practical worksheets. It's more of a workbook than a book, but it's full of beautiful stories. And it's a pleasure to welcome back for part 2 of the DeGraff series, the authors of The Creative Mindset, Jeff and Staney DeGraff. Welcome back.
Thanks for having us, Aidan.
It's good to be
It's
back.
great to have you back. And I thought we'd get straight away stuck in because the book really demystifies creativity. It doesn't come from this lone genius, etc. Maybe we'll just demystify that and get stuck into the acronym thereafter.
The book has an interesting origin, and it really sort of relates to our careers. So I'm the last graduate student of a fellow named Rudolf Arnheim. And Arnheim is the guy that gives us almost all these terms for creativity: visual thinking, design thinking, all that kind of stuff. And he starts writing in the 1920s. And in fact, when he died, the New York Times has a 2-page obituary for him. And I was very lucky to be a very young man. And he is the link to all this, because the whole study of creativity starts at the University of Berlin in about 1900 with a man named Max Wertheimer. And Wertheimer has these famous colleagues, Kurt Kafka, Wolfgang Kohler, and they create this school of thought called Gestalt psychology. It's basically perception and how your brain creates new ideas. So Arnheim is the guy that sort of takes us forward into that. And I'm the last of his disciples, if you will. And some of the other ones become very, very well known as well. So the origin of the book was to say that there are different levels of creativity and that anybody can kind of do them, but it's like climbing a ladder, right? To get to the higher forms of creativity. And the whole idea was to make it really practical for the classes Staney and I teach on creative thinking, what's called creativity at work, how in fact you bring these in. And when it started, you got to remember, when I started teaching this class, it was crazy that anybody in the business school would teach this. But of course, now with design thinking and everything else, every business school has one. So, 40 years down the line, it's whatever. But I could tell you when we started this, it was absolutely considered very much out of bounds what you did at the business school.
I love those stories, man, because it just shows you, we forget that most ideas started out being misunderstood, and the people driving those ideas were definitely misunderstood and sometimes ostracized as well, or considered weird.
I think the whole idea here is to demystify this and build it more like a curriculum. And it's quite literally a curriculum at the University of Michigan. And it relates to everything else, because you can't have innovation if you don't have creativity. So let's add a sharp edge to it if we can. You can have all the AI large language models in the world, which is the field Staney and I both come from. But the notion is, if you can't think creatively, then you're not going to have anything that's unique, that's really significantly better and new. So it all started with a very early book that I wrote. And I coined a term in the late 80s, which we had the presence of mind to actually trademark. I coined this term creativizing, to creativize. And what I meant by creativize was adding creativity to ordinary, normal, standard things. So this is taking creativity from the realm of I'm Isaac Newton, or I'm Orson Welles, or whoever you're thinking about, to we all do this, but we don't recognize it. And so we start the book with just some basic things that people should do, right? So one of my favorite ones, if I could just get us started here with this, is what time of day are you creative? Some people, Stanley's a night hawk. I'm a morning person, right? Real early morning person. So why do I come into my sanctuary here at the University of Michigan is if I'm here at my desk at 6:30, no one's here for a while, right? And because I need mental space, I'm doing my creative work at that time. Stanley, she'll stay up late. That's when her creative work happens. So it's just paying attention to simple things like what gives you energy, what takes your energy, when is this happening, who's around you, is music playing? And once you start doing that, you start to understand something that most people don't understand at all. It's not creativity on demand. It's creativity when creativity demands it, but everyone is different. So it's like learning your instrument. So step one, what is your instrument? And then
And
before we get into any of this other stuff.
We talked last week about how innovation needs courage. You need to actually be able to feel confident in yourself to actually try something really different because people, like you said, could ostracize you. Creativity is the same thing. A lot of people have lost confidence, right? In terms of, am I really creative? So actually the book takes them through simple exercises to progressively difficult ones and more complicated ones at the end, because it's really like, okay, so let's just, start with take a walk, field trips, that's what we call it. Or, look at the things in the world and see, are there things that inspire you?
I love how the book's laid out, and I love how practical you make it. And you end the book on this idea of getting into a flow state. I think for me, that is the piece most people miss about this. Like people will go to me, and I'm sure you have the same thing to go, how did you think of that? Or how did you write that? Or where do you find the time? And literally, you have to actually create the time. You have to create, but ideally, what works well for you. And I wondered, do you find this as well? Jeff, I know you go early into the office. For me, it's the same. I need the studio I have here. It has an atmosphere that I've created here, but also I have to graduate up those brainwave states to get into a place where I'm actually going to write. And also, I'll think about what I'm going to write for a few weeks before I write it. And it's almost like putting the ingredients in to marinate, and then they'll mix with my thoughts. I'll come up with analogies and metaphors, etc. And then the idea seems to pop out, but you've concocted the recipe for it to happen.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Everyone is different. And I start out with these, I'm going to read here a little bit from the beginning of the book, but just, so let me give you what I think the preparation should be. And it's not all of these catch, they don't. So one is notice when and how you're creative, right? That's the first. Second, be prepared at all time to capture ideas. I carry notebooks around. I drive my wife crazy. I leave notes everywhere. I'm a note guy, right?
She's nodding furiously for those
Yeah,
people just
I
listening
know.
to us.
I'm a mess that way. Notes everywhere. Pay attention to who and what gives you energy. I mean, I know this sounds very kind of new agey, but it's not. I mean, the notion is when does it show up? Consult the muses in your mind. I'm very big on things rattle around in my mind. I just had a Psychology Today article where I talked about, to me, I have soundtracks that show up in my mind, and they're really not earworms. They're just somehow things show up. And when they do, I pay attention to them because a lot of times what I'm wiggling around in my brain is in those. My big one, look for signs, incongruities, and most importantly, anomalies. Things that don't make sense are golden. They're gold, right? They don't make sense for a reason. And my big thing is, instead of saying that doesn't make sense, you got to dive into those things. Challenge boundaries and authorities. Creative people have a lot of self-authorizing behavior, meaning that people are going to create a lot of rules. Now, this is where it gets a little weird because boundaries actually create creativity, right? So this is making sense. So it's not out of the box stuff. And the research says it's nonsense anyway. The issue is constraints actually help, but you have to challenge them. You have to engage in them. Escape assumptions about how things should be. This is a hard one for me. We all have that voice of judgment, get into things, and being a professor, that's really hard. I just got off of all of these telecasts right before this one. And there's a part of me that wants to get in and go, that's not a very good idea or whatever, but you got to escape that and go, okay, Because here's why. Here's what your listeners need to understand. No matter how bad the idea is, you got to say, that's a great idea. Here's why. Because if they actually start to implement it, they'll get disconfirming feedback and they'll make adjustments. This is like being a parent. There's two kinds of parents on the playground. There's the don't do it parent, and then there's the hurt, didn't it parent. Now, assuming that Junior's not, on playing on the freeway, hurt, didn't it is how we all learn. That's how we become creative, through the failure cycle, which people don't, they don't want to acknowledge. And finally, and this is as important, and I really see this in you, Aiden, in the way you talk about things, you have to have a sense of destiny. So positivity doesn't mean happy, 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 happy. I don't know where people get this from. Positivity means I'm going here and really focusing on getting there. So those are kind of the things that we start the book with, is saying, before we get into techniques, let's start with you, what you need to be able to do that you can do. You don't have to be a genius. You don't have to be smart, right? You don't have to be a perfectly good person, right? Just be yourself, understand your instrument, and move forward.
There's a book you mentioned in your book. It's by Paul Torrance, 1993, and he talks about this idea of becoming a beyonder. I really like this, and I wanted to share with you. I don't know if you've heard about this beautiful study where they had children playing in a playground, and when the playground had no fence, the children would center around the middle, but when they put a fence around it, the children would go right to the edges of the fence. And for me, it was speaking to this idea of the boundary, but also that when you have that, like you said, when you have some type of constraint, it at least gives you somewhere to go as far as you can in that moment. And I love this in the book that you talk about. That's the beauty. It's not thinking big. It's thinking big by starting small. And this idea of beyonder is key to that.
There's a lot of studies that actually have talked about psychological safety and safe spaces and everything. But that's what it is, though. When you have actually a guideline and you know that you're safe in that environment, you become more creative and you tend to try more things. And I think that's what it is with the fence, right?
I have a colleague who's now retired, who's very famous, named Carl Weick. Wonderful man. And his whole thing was sense making, and he's very famous for this, but the other thing was small wins. And here's what people don't get. So when you think about like a venture capitalist and you think about A-round money, the beginning money, when you start seeding money, right, to your listeners who don't know what that means, what a venture capitalist is looking for is a huge return. So they're not looking for things to be tightly wrapped. They're looking for things that swim out farther. And the issue is you give a lot of companies or organizations a little bit of money so that their small win is a small risk, but they're trying something radical in it. So you hedge. So going big doesn't mean I'm trying to do something huge. Going big means I'm trying something small that's significantly different. And you can see when you go to Picasso's museum in Barcelona or wherever you're at in the world, you can see Picasso trying small things that are quite radical. And they're works in progress. We all do that. So when you talked about writing, one of the things that I have to laugh about is I talk into my phone when I go into Constitutional every day, go on a long walk, talk to my phone, I come back, throw it on my computer, make outlines, and I'll probably write 6 or 7 drafts of something. And what I'm doing is it's not imperfecting it. I'm working out my thinking, right? I'm working out the creative act is I'm working it out. And the mistake that I make, and I still make it at my age, which is embarrassing, I'll say, I've got time on the flight from here to Singapore. It's a long flight, and I'll write, and I never can. And anything that I do write is terrible, right? And then I'll say, okay, when I get to Singapore, I'm going to do these 5 things. And I'll go for a long walk, and all of a sudden I realize I can write. And I go back to my hotel room. For the next 2 hours, I'm writing. So even there's a bit of hypocrisy in this, in that even though I know better, I fall into this trap that everybody else falls into, which is I'm going to be creative there, even though at my advanced age, I know I'm not.
I love it. And, with the Picasso thing, I heard this an acronym, FAIL, first attempt is learning.
You're hitting on a really key thing. And that is creativity and learning are inextricably linked. And that's part of the reason for this book was to say, if we're building a curriculum, what the iterative cycle is, what the failure cycle is, it's a learning cycle. And what you're trying to do in a learning cycle is you're trying to diversify your thoughts as far as you can. That's why incidentally, for your listeners, innovation doesn't happen at the middle of the bell curve. It almost never does. It happens at the edges where you have a crisis or you're on a roll. And the reason is risk and reward are reversed. Think about it. People change when they get a divorce, when they lose their health, when they lose their job, whatever. And the same is true for big companies. Apple, the first trillion-dollar company, basically is on the verge of bankruptcy. And when risk and reward are reversed, right? So it's not the 80-20 rule, it's the 20-80 rule. It's easier to change 20% of an organization, 80%, than 80% of an organization, 20%. The innovation moves in. Well, the same is true for people. People have a tendency to be really creative at the edges of the bell curve. And the reason is you have less to lose and more to gain. So these experiments really, again, coming back to how to think about this, it's almost counter to the way we've trained our children. These experiments eventually move back into things that are productive. But this book isn't really about being socially productive. This book is about developing your instrument, about being more creative. This could easily be a self-help book as it is an organizational book.
Before we move into the acronym CREATE, there's one last thing I wanted to ask you. And you work with Fortune 500 companies all over the world, all over different industries. This idea of thinking big by starting small, and you mentioned about this idea of seed money. Inside an organization, one of the things you see often is that an innovation team is given unlimited budget and straight away it drowns them. And I heard this great idea. It was Sadhguru, this Indian mystic, and he had this idea of gold crushes ants, that if you give a piece of gold to an ant, you crush it. Now, he was talking about if you give somebody a gift that they haven't developed the muscles to carry yet, or if you give them a position too early, maybe it's nepotism, you give them a position and they haven't developed the requisite skills to be able to carry that position, that they actually flounder and fail. But I thought about it the same way as if you give an innovation team too much budget, that they actually can fail quickly rather than giving them incremental budget. And I wondered, for the many people who listen to the show who are innovation leaders, what is your advice and what's your experience of that?
I think whenever you create an organizational hierarchy for innovation, it always fails. Here's a way to think about this, organizational leaders. The farther away you are from headquarters, every expat knows this, the more likely you're going to see innovation, right? And the reason is not because they're more a genius, but because they're the way to solve the problem, they don't have the resources to do it. So they have to find a new way. So there's something about innovation that over-resource doesn't help, right? And I can go into talk about a lot of stuff we've worked on over these, but I want you to think about this. Great innovators, they're never at the center of the circle. They're always standing at the edge of the circle. And there's a part to this. I know I'm guilty of it in big time. There's a part to this. If you get too close to the center of the circle, everything has a tendency to converge. Everything has a tendency to maintain. And what you call innovation at scale is by definition, because it's operationalized, incremental. So the larger the innovation is, right, and that the more, because you have to build it, the more incremental it's going to be. So you have to prove the concept. So you have to swim way out. I know that IDEO says this, and anybody who's built stuff for a long time will tell you this, that you have to be at the edge of the circle, which means these are people who don't think like you. They're probably not in your subject area. All you have to do is look at these cities like going to Cambridge in the UK or Ann Arbor, where Staney and I live. Where are the great innovation ideas coming from? Now, they get built in the universities. I'll give you that, the big companies. But the great ideas are coming from the coffee shops, the pubs, and where people are connecting in ways that they wouldn't normally connect. And the experiments are starting, which have a high failure rate, but there's very little loss. So I'm very much against these kind of huge corporate incubator systems. I get brought in all the time. I'm in one right now. They have buildings, they have a lot of money. And don't get me wrong, we need big corporate centers to build, but the revolution doesn't start there. So I was just let me just tell you this story just quickly. So I was just asked by this group of architects. So I was just at this panel discussion with all these architects. And they're talking about all the stuff they're building and all these incredible new buildings. And I said, where have you built places for people to hide? And they said, what? And I said, where have you built places for people to hide? They said, people to hide. I'm like, yeah, innovators hide in plain sight. And then one of the other panelists said, I built a building in this place that I was at called ATS, right? And people said, because it sounded like he was building a big innovation center. And the person, what's ATS stand for? He said, across the street. And I thought, the first innovation room Staney and I built was across the street. The whole idea is you have to have places for innovators to work it out.
I was even thinking in my office, right? So I'm the only person of this big office, takes 10 people. I'm the only person here, and I sit in the corner with nobody can see my screen, but there's nobody here. And I was actually talking to innovators about that, and they were all like, me too. And this idea of you want to find a kind of comfortable place. But we better get stuck into the acronym, because I know you're under a bit of time pressure today. I thought the best way to set up the first one, which is clarify, which is getting the challenge right, was this study that you mentioned, where it asked business leaders and school superintendents the simple question, what does creativity mean? And the startling difference in their answers. Of the superintendents now in schools, 48% believed that problem solving is the skill that best demonstrates creativity. But the business leaders, it was actually identifying the problem articulation. I thought that was fascinating, because it just shows you, and we'll talk about this later on, different perspectives, how you even see what clarification is in the first place.
I would tell you, my class at Michigan, right, the one that started 40 years ago, you're not even allowed to start creative thinking until you identify the problem, which takes half the semester. If you don't know what's wrong, you have to go through many iterations to find the center of what the challenge is. It's either a problem or an opportunity, right? So step one is not just clarifying what the endemic or real reason is. The other one is why you? Why are you working on this? And one of the things I tell people a lot, which I think is really important, is whenever you're working on a problem, you have to really ask yourself, who owns the problem? Because nobody cares about your creative idea. I hate to tell listeners this, but they don't. What they care about is you solving their problem. This comes back to the CEO, the executive issue that you're raising. So step one is, how do you actually clarify what is at the center of the issue? Because most of the time, I always tell people, the most important book of the 20th century, according to the New York Public Library, was Anna Karenina. And of course, it starts with happy families are all happy for the same reason, and unhappy families are unhappy for a multitude of reasons. And my big thing is, whenever you got a problem, there's a multitude of reasons that it's not working. And you got to start with, okay, what can I really handle here? What can I, how much of this can I really take on? What's my level of ambition?
And I just want to add, in our programs with corporation and also with the military, this is the one singular thing that is the most difficult. It's because in order to really deep dive into this problem, you're also faced with a lot of ambiguity. You really don't know. You don't know what's actually is being solved, right? And a lot of people are uncomfortable with that.
What you're really looking for at the beginning is disconfirming feedback. This is a hard thing for people to get. You're looking for where you're wrong. And so the creative process is highly iterative. You think in all these big projects we've ever run, whatever we started with a group that they're sure this is the problem, 6 weeks in, they're sure it's not. It's a different thing. Well, that's part of it. You're learning about what's really going on here every time you sort of take a step forward. So it's a work in progress. And people who are trained differently, and this is where they really confuse project management with being creative, where they say, this is the part we're going to have. It's like, well, is that what you found? I was just on a call right before this one where they have this very big, complicated technology thing, and they had this assumption, and they got on this call with the owner of this assumption, and probably halfway through the presentation, one of the key assumptions was wrong. It's like, when you pull that out, a lot of things start to fall and people start to panic. I'm like, don't panic. This is normal. This is a normal thing. Now you're going to have to build it up again, that what we think is the challenge is a little bit different than what we thought it was.
And it's important, actually, what Staney said there about the psychological safety. They don't want to be seen to be wrong in front of people, witnesses. And that's one of the big problems, isn't it? And you're like kind of go, no, we encourage that because you want to fail early because it's less expensive.
I like what you said, though. That's something I think that really great creative people do, is there's a vulnerability that you have to show, to say, I don't know at this point what this actually is, but I'm brave enough to go figure it out. But I need everyone to know that I'm still figuring it out.
In that chapter, you give tons of examples of how to do this, wayfinding techniques, you call them, and very, very simple, these wayfinding techniques. But let's jump to the next one, the next in the acronym, which is the R, which is replicate. I love this chapter because I have a fascination with biomimicry, but also this idea of reapplying ideas. So I'll let you guys take this one away.
I have a picture here of Buckminster Fuller. If your listeners don't know who that, Bucky Fuller was very influential in my early career. If you go to Disney World and you see the big ball at the beginning of Epcot, it's a spore. It's part of the geodesic dome thing that Fuller did. And if you go to the museum in Singapore, the Science Museum with the hand, it's Bucky Fuller, right? The notion is the beginning is just seeing with new eyes. That's all it is. And I like, one of the things I do in my class with artificial intelligence when it comes to making new friends is I call them heroes of the imagination. Two of my favorite books of all time were written by Dan Borsten, who passed away, of course, was the Library of Congress, who wrote these books, The Discoverers, The Creators, right? Amazing. I think he's won the Pulitzer Prize like 2 or 3 times. But one of the things that I really like about the heroes of the imagination is that you can use artificial intelligence to create personas. So my class does that. So I make them think around problems. So they have to consult people because we know a lot about Emerson or we know a lot about William Blake, right? So imagine you build a persona, right? Which a large language model can. So the notion is in my class, you're required to consult these, and I call these matches. So they're going to give you matches, and it doesn't mean you pick everything. They're not doing your creative work. But the notion is you're getting a lot more texture in your inputs, just like you would if you start talking to people outside of your field. So the beginning of replicate is simply what we sometimes call search and reapply, right? Go find it and go put it in your area. One of my favorite stories comes from Tom Kelly at IDEO. And he tells a story about he had this problem at the Mayo Clinic with patient satisfaction. So what he did was he had the doctors go live in the Ritz-Carlton for a week, right? And they got a lot of ideas about what that was like and great service. And then the next week he had them live in their hospital bed. So they learned a few things and patient satisfaction went up. So these are the kinds of things that anybody can do. It doesn't take any time. It's your normal day. I mean, you get a pair of binoculars and go on a walk on Saturday morning and watch how birds fly, watch how fish swim. You'll get a lot of ideas about how things are designed.
Yeah, the other day, my son was talking about owls and about how their flat patterns and their wings are designed very differently than an eagle, like a raptor, because that's why they're so quiet when they descend.
I love that. My son's still looking for royalties for many of the ideas he gave me for my book because he was always giving me ideas for metaphors, etc. I love that idea that you mentioned about the Mayo Clinic, getting out of the building, going and seeing places. An example I experienced firsthand is the Accenture Research and Innovation Labs here in Dublin, in Ireland. And the team actually went a step further. So you were saying about the Mayo Clinic guys went to Ritz-Carlton, saw how patients were treated, brought some of that mindset back, and they were like anthropologists observing. Well, in Accenture, they actually hired people from places like Ritz-Carlton as the receptionists. So there's beautiful welcome that's totally unlike a consultancy. So I thought that was a nice add-on to something there. But I love this chapter, Replicate, and this whole idea, steal like an artist, the whole idea of engage in biomimicry, etc. But the next one then is elaborate. So this is multiplying ideas by adding new ones. And again, another term. And I love how you pepper in all these terms. And I love how you knew many of these people as well, that you worked with them and studied with them. The idea of bisociative. And this was coined by the controversial art novelist Arthur Koestler in 1964.
Yeah, I really liked Arthur Koestler, although he was, his views of the world I didn't share. I'll leave it at that. Because he wrote Darkness at Noon and some other big famous books. He was a very brilliant man. And the Salzburg Festival and all that stuff. So that, that goes back to sort of my origins, these connections to Europe, right? But the whole idea of elaborate was at a very superficial level, your brain functions on language. You don't have to be Wittgenstein and be a philosopher mind person to get this, but by moving words around in your brain, it's relatively easy to see new combinations. Now, of course, AI does this pretty doggone well, but there's some very simple things here. So let me tell you what the three things in the book are. The first one that's relatively easy is just random words. And there's actually an old technique for divination called biomancy. And famously in St. Augustine's Confessions, he talks about how he has this conversion to Christianity because he opens up a book and points his finger at a word. And the notion is anybody can do this with anything. It doesn't have to be defined. I want to point that out. It just dissociates things. It takes something that you normally don't connect to something else. Incidentally, you can reverse that, which is called to disassociate things, right? There's a way to do that. It's called defamiliarization. There's a different way to do it. So your brain works both ways with language. So that's easy. Anybody can just take a book at any time when you're stuck, open up the book and point your finger at a word. And just do this like 5 times. And your brain will automatically, because your brain assimilates and accommodates, your brain will automatically make a connection. That's the way your brain functions, right? So you don't have to worry about the neural net. Just make sure you've had enough, iced tea or whatever you drink to make sure make sure that the sugars in your brain are working. The second thing in there is something that actually comes to us from an advertising executive, which Alex Osborne, people forget Alex Osborne was an advertising executive, and he noticed that people who made great ad campaigns were able to use certain words that were active words, like substitute and combine. So he called it scamper, SCAMPR, right? Scamper. And some of these people came out of these things that he's talking about became J. Walter Thompson and these big ad agencies. And so the ad agencies like the 50s and 60s use this stuff all the time. So if you watch Mad Men, you'll see this stuff in there. So what he's doing is he's taking words, not just random now, with a little more oomph to them. And then the final one comes from an English guy who lives in Italy, a very famous guy, which you call lateral thinking in Europe, right? A guy named Edward de Bono, and he called these thinking hats, right? So he has these different kind of archetypal hats saying, can you look at the same problem from these different points of view? But the reason they're all under elaborate is they're all just highly fluency-based terms. So the 4 things we do know about creativity, right, is number 1, fluency. If you have more ideas than other people do, you're much more likely to come up with something. 2 is flexibility, which is what we talked about in Replicate. If you go from one area and apply it to another. 1 is freedom. The notion is you can have really bad ideas, but the notion is once you start to implement those ideas, you'll get disconfirming feedback. And the final is flow, right, which is Mihai, right? Csikszentmihalyi, right, the famous Hungarian cognitive scientist who talks about we run in certain periods of time. So all of these concepts under elaborate kind of fall into that brainstorming, moving pictures and words around in your brain, which is actually not very hard for your brain to do. This is not high level stuff.
You mentioned De Bono that had all his books up there, and he passed away a few years ago. So unfortunately, before I had time to get him onto the show. But one of the things I do now with AI, you mentioned this, was you can actually get it to do a 6 Thinking's Hat review of what you write or what you produce or your ideas. But also one of the ones I used that I was delighted to see you mention in the book was Think and Grow Rich, Napoleon Hill's work, this idea of a mastermind that Napoleon Hill wrote about. And I get it to do that as well. So you actually can have people, different viewpoints from different people in society, different authors.
That's where my board of advisors on AI came from. I make them build a board of advisors, and I make them do AI and go get a board of advisors, a mastermind alliance, right? So, and I make them read this book by Robert Greene, Mastery. I make them all read it. I think that young people need to know how mastery is really developed. And this is back to the book, the creativity, the whole idea here, the creative mindset is that we're building capability. We're building as we now need to go to A. Now it's harder thing to do. So each time it gets a little more advanced. We did it this way, but it could have been a pyramid.
I love that. And, Green's work, he's really focusing on helping people today. I find purpose, etc. We keep going because we're going to run out of time and not get through.
We can run a little long. We're fine.
There's one thing, defamiliarize, I thought was just, I paid attention to all these little terms And, I'll mention another quote by a painter, which is Henri Matisse. He said, "There's nothing as difficult as a truly creative painter to paint a rose because first they have to forget all the roses they've ever seen before." And it made me think of defamiliarize, because actually that's the problem, because we have this functional fixedness with everything.
I think you're right on it. I think the hardest thing to do, self-help across the board, is get people out of your head. It's very hard to do. And to me, that's the biggest thing, is what do you actually think, right? Can we get people out of our head? Can we get, what the Buddhists call beginner's mind? Can you get back to a beginner's mind? Aristotle's a great term for this that biologists use, but Aristotle uses a very different way. It's called neoteny. It means to be childlike, not childish. Childlike. And so when we look at, biology, there's a very specific thing that goes on with that. But what Aristotle's writing about also is, can you get back to that, what Staney was talking about, that child wonder, the ability to free associate in some ways as an adult.
I'm going to keep going because you're sparking lots of ideas for me. One thing to just mention, the idea of the axolotl. So the axolotl for me is actually a perfect metaphor for an organization needing to stay young, because it's capable of actually forever staying young because of stem cells, etc. And this idea of an organization, Bezos famously wrote one of his Amazon letters to shareholders, and he talked about Amazon staying in day one. And straight away, it talks to the axolotl on this idea of constantly embracing your inner self, your inner youth the whole time. But we better keep going on to associate, because the steps come in a specific order for a reason, which is why the acceptance of discomfort and the readiness of the unexpected come first, because they pave the way then for associate, which is next.
Yeah, associate is something your brain does that we think only humans can do. So we used to think only humans were creative, and then we realized that Chaldean crows and orangutans and everybody else, elephants are creative, right? So, we've come a long way in 100 years. But one of the things that your brain is capable of doing, associative, is what's sometimes called, we call it adaptive reasoning in the book. The technical term is analogical thinking, right? You can say something is like something. And the fact that we can communicate that is quite interesting. Of course, marketing people love this. So somebody's trying to sell Sprite, and somebody jumps on a hot day into a cool pool, and we're supposed to make the connection that Sprite is refreshing, right? Which it is. But the whole idea of adaptive reasoning is something is like something else. And why that's so important is because people have creative ideas. They usually try and glue them together, a bunch of things that don't really fit. And what metaphors and analogies do incredibly well is they bring things together. So one of the things I write about a lot are, I think that innovations are not in ecosystems, they're in solar systems, because it's easier to imagine a sun or binary stars trading planets. It's easier to imagine how things go together. They orbit, right? They have an organic way in which they fit. And so the whole idea of analogical thinking or adaptive thinking here is saying, how are these parts like this? Well, it moves on to what I call imaginary friends. And imaginary friends are people who have they're systems thinkers. They're people who have already thought about how systems go. So it's not just sort of abstract. How would they have put this together? What would they have done around this? And we could go back to Picasso, et cetera. But when you start talking about like Bezos, it's a great example of, he wasn't cash positive for 15 years and he had a picture. I knew Steve Jobs, right? My relationship there. When people say, did he really understand what he was building out? And the answer was yes, actually he did, even when he was being kicked out the first time, right? So the issue is there's also people who have this idea of, how all these things coordinate. And then the final one, of course, is something called synaptics. And it's really timely because this guy named William Gordon was brought in very early on to the space program. He was MIT. There were two of them. There's MIT guys. And basically what they did was they used analogical thinking to say, first, let's take the problem and deconstruct the problem. What's really wrong? Then they have all these what are called excursions, where we go off and think about all the kinds of things we could do. But then the most important thing is now we have to force fit our metaphorical ideas back into the idea. Now, this is the part that's really hard for people. It's really hard cognitively because what you're doing is using metaphors in reverse. You're saying, so let me give you an example that's very famous. One is eco-imagination, which we worked on. We were part of that whole thing at General Electric, the $16 billion spend. And what they started with, which something I didn't understand very well, was how do all these pieces go together like NASCAR? Now, I'm not a NASCAR guy, so I don't know. But what was interesting is as we got all the pieces, there were things in NASCAR that we didn't have in eco-imagination. So we had to reverse and go, well, what would we have to build to be like that? And that's how things got built out. So in this stage, we're synchronizing, we're coordinating, and we're using our brain's ability to look at complex clusters and relate that to the creative activity that's at hand, which is not easy.
A beautiful segue for the next of the acronym, which is translate, because this metaphor or analogies give you ideas then to be able to translate into a story that encompass everybody and bring everybody on the journey.
I will say the big thing about this is all you have to do is look at a child. You have a child try and tell you a story, or have an awkward adult try and tell you a joke. And what you realize is telling a story is a very complex cognitive activity because there are characters, there's actions, there's plot, there's folk color. There's a lot of things that have to happen. So in this chapter, we talk about the beginning of this is about storyboarding. What Walt Disney, Da Vinci did it. How do you take ideas? And of course, those people who are fluent in PowerPoint, you're already storyboarding. That's a storyboarding tool. So what you're doing with PowerPoint is you're trying to get the story right. And if you tell the story in a chronological way, you're probably not very interesting. So, you have to work around, and the book tells you why people don't tell interesting stories. How, sometimes you have to start with, let me start with telling you how I was trying to build this thing at Domino's. You start with, let me tell you I met Steve Jobs, right? And then you work back. You got to catch the reader, right? And it's just what you said. You have to bring everybody into the story, right? People want to be part of the story. The next part of this, I think, which is really interesting, but you have to really be into this. They're what I call morphologies. All right. This actually starts with the Brothers Grimm. I know this is weird, the people who write the fairy tales, and Vladimir Prop, the famous Russian. But the notion is, if you start thinking about like cases and case studies, I've had 3 student groups win the big McKinsey case study national competition right here at the University of Michigan. And it's a simple way to do it. On one side, on the y-axis, you say players. And on the x-axis, you say actions that people could take. And whenever you deconstruct, what's called deconstruct to reconstruct, whenever you deconstruct to reconstruct, you see millions of possibilities. And where this really takes off is like the fashion industry, where, what if I took orange and I put it on this kind of purse? Or they do this all the time. So the notion is when you get into these kind of, like you go to Milan and you see people do this, what they're really doing are morphologies. They have their own words for it, but it's really a morphological one. And then the final one, which of course business people do all the time now, and AI is very helpful for this, is scenario making, which is now saying not just what could go right and what could go wrong. Here's all the drivers. Because there is no data on the future, the only thing we can really know is the things that we know are going to drive the future. So for example, I'm teaching at this large university. We know that Americans are having fewer and fewer babies. In other parts of the world, even worse. So we're not going to have as many college kids, right? That's something that we can actually know in a scenario. The challenges of scenario and the challenges of innovation and creativity is very simple, Aiden. And that is what's called event-driven innovation, the things you didn't see, right? And those are always the ones that whenever you're creating, you have to swim out farther in order to anticipate those.
This chapter is actually extremely hard to do because you have to have developed a lot of the other skills from the previous chapters to get to this point. But I think it's also the most impactful because story can really change your life. When you want to innovate or when you want to change something, you need to know and you need to have this vision in your mind about what that is. And the story that you tell can come true if you do have it right.
It's not that it's hard to do. It's hard to do well. All you have to do is think about a novel, who writes well. So the notion is everyone can do all of these. But what we're trying to do in the book is to say to be really good, to be world class at this, So there's a difference between if you're doing it for yourself,
Right.
that's great. The book will work great for you. If you're trying to get better, the book will work great for you. But if you've got a team, going back to your leaders, and you're trying to build something that no one else has, imagine when you go to your pitch day, right? If you can tell a winning story, and we see this all the time, Dragon's Lair in the UK, right? Everything stuff.
Right.
If you can tell a winning story, right, you win, right? That's because that's a very complicated thing. And if we would have had more, if the book would have allowed us to go farther, which it didn't, we would have talked about things like meditation, which are higher order things, dream theory. So there's a lot of things your brain does that's super creative that doesn't fit in the book because these were things that you can develop, right? Where the other things, I think that maybe you should talk to somebody in an ashram or somebody who's in a cathedral somewhere or something. Although I do want to acknowledge that those are higher forms of creativity.
And you can see why this book is so valuable for you as a person as well, to shape your own life, to own your own story, to create your own story, to understand your skill sets and recombine them in new ways as well, which is why it's a great book. It's full of exercise, full of tools as well. And we have a copy up for grabs. Don't forget, if you're a member of our Substack. We better finish before you got to go, Jeff, on the final one, which is evaluate.
I'm guilty of this. I'm an ideaaholic. I probably should be in a 12-step program, right? I've notebooks of ideas. So when people say, how do you write so many articles or whatever? Just like you, it's not hard. In fact, I forget a lot of stuff. I have to go back and look at my work. But evaluate is basically saying, it's like being an editor of a film. How you evaluate will largely determine which ideas win. And so in the book, we give you 4 or 5 ways to evaluate ideas, like forced choice evaluation and matrix evaluation, the GE workout method, which I think is very valuable. What's hard to do, big payout, easy to do, small payouts, et cetera. So these are the kind of things you would see in any engineering course or any business school. But why that's important is that people forget that this is the most important creative step you'll take. Because how you evaluate will determine what you pick. And one of the things Staney and I have experienced over and over and over again is we will be in these groups and someone will have a $1 billion idea and they'll leave it on the wall. And the notion is you're evaluating this for an incremental idea. So the creative part is let's evaluate it this way. And so we have a long track record of some really big ideas that became very valuable simply by saying you're evaluating this the wrong way. And this goes back to what Staney said at the beginning. We evaluate our children the wrong way. We evaluate college people the wrong way. We're evaluating the wrong way.
It's hard to not evaluate them that way, right? I mean, it's hard to figure out this idea that could be great, but you don't know what to do with it. Because it takes a lot of time, but it's also the ambiguity. And again, we're always reluctant to do that. And I think a lot of people have more trouble with that than others. And this is why I said also in the beginning that it's just like innovation, creativity takes a lot of courage.
And that's the journey. The book, again, I want to put the book in the right perspective. This is a book like learning how to speak another language or learning how to master an area. It's a book about how you actually develop that skill, right? And it takes you through the things that are easier to do, harder to do. But the point of this is you're able to do all of this, but it really has to do with what the level of ambition and what the reader's trying to do with. So at the University of Michigan, what I want these young people to be able to, they want to go on and be innovators in these businesses. That's why they're in my class, right? It's creativity at work, right? But if you're a person who's trying to write a novel, then this is the way you do that. Or if you're a person who's trying to start a business, you're a person who's stuck in their career and just wants to feel more creative in doing something, this is a book for you because it's going to take you on that journey in a very practical way. And with each step, you're going to develop more competency, more confidence as well. And that's kind of the idea of the book.
Beautiful. And again, as I said, so valuable for you on a personal level. You reminded me of a quote there where you're talking about these ideas, these ugly babies. It's a quote by one of your favorites, Buckminster Fuller. There's nothing in a caterpillar that tells you it's going to be a butterfly. One of my favorite bookie quotes. Maybe we'll share where people can find you. I know you do workshops, you do keynotes all over the world. Where's the best place?
Oh, well, JeffDeGraff.com is the easiest place for everything, including the businesses. JeffDeGraff.com. And I'm one of the original LinkedIn influencers, so you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm easy to find, and I publish regularly. So you'll see the stuff I write for Big Think and for Inc. Magazine and all the other places I write for will all show up on LinkedIn. So JeffDeGraff.com and on LinkedIn. And Aiden, I just want to thank you for having us. This has been a delight.
It's an absolute pleasure having you. And we're going to be back for part 3, the finale, the trilogy. So to cover that baby behind me there, same colors. I can see you like your colors because they bring into some of the concept we talk about in part 1. We're going to cover the art of change in part 3. Don't forget, you can win a copy of this. It's really a toolkit. It's not really a book. And it's a pleasure to have had you on the show. Staney and Jeff DeGraff, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you.
Thanks again to our sponsor, Kyndryl, who underpin the IT infrastructure behind most of the world's airlines, many of the world's hospitals, healthcare, and indeed banks. They run and reimagine the technology systems that drive advantage for the world's leading businesses. With a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched managed service capability, Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. You can find Kyndryl and the Kyndryl Institute at KYNDRYL, Kyndryl.com.